Somewhere in the jungles of central Mexico, buried beneath centuries of vine and volcanic rock, there is a treasure that nobody has ever found. Not the Spanish, not the British, not the treasure hunters who've spent their entire lives digging through Aztec ruins with shovels and sonar equipment. And not the curse hunters who swear the gold was never meant to be found in the first place. Now, if you pull up a map of the Atlantic world in the year 1519, you'll see something remarkable. There's a line. It starts at the port of Seville in southern Spain, cuts southwest across the open Atlantic, threads through the Caribbean islands, and lands on the Gulf Coast of Mexico at a place the Spanish called Veracruz. That line represents the most important trade route in human history. More gold moved along that route in a single century than the entire Roman Empire accumulated in 500 years, and every single ounce of it was stolen. But here's where things get strange. If you trace that same route in reverse, from the jungles of Mexico back across the Caribbean, you'll notice something. The route passes directly through the most pirate-infested waters on Earth, the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the Straits of Florida, the shallow banks of the Bahamas where ships ran aground and pirates waited like wolves. Every piece of Aztec gold that made it to Spain had to survive that gauntlet first, and a staggering amount of it didn't. Now, zoom into the map one more time. Focus on the Yucatan Peninsula, the coast of Honduras, the Bay Islands. This is the exact region where, according to local legend, cursed Aztec gold ended up in the hands of pirates who had no idea what they were carrying. Gold that was never supposed to leave the temples. Gold that, according to the Aztec priests, carried the wrath of gods that the Spanish didn't believe in and the pirates didn't care about. This is the story that inspired one of the most successful film franchises ever made. But the real history behind it is darker, stranger, and far more disturbing than anything Hollywood put on screen. The sacred nature of Aztec gold. Let's start with what Aztec gold actually was, because the popular image is completely off. When we hear Aztec gold, we picture coins. Neat, round, stackable coins like the ones in the Pirates of the Caribbean chest. But the Aztecs didn't use coins. They didn't even think of gold the way Europeans did. To the Spanish, gold was wealth. It was currency. It was the entire reason they crossed an ocean and risked death by scurvy, hurricane, and hostile coastline. Gold was power, converted into metal. To the Aztecs, gold was something else entirely. They called it Teocuitlatl, which translates roughly to excrement of the gods, not because they thought it was worthless. The opposite. They believed gold was a divine substance, literally shed from the bodies of their gods, the way skin flakes off a sunburn. Gold was sacred. It belonged in temples, on altars, and on the bodies of priests during rituals. It was not money. It was not trade goods. It was holy material, and removing it from its sacred context was an act of cosmic violation. This distinction matters because it's the entire foundation of the curse mythology. When the Spanish arrived and started melting down Aztec religious artifacts into gold bars for easier transport back to Spain, the Aztec priests didn't just see theft, they saw desecration. They saw men ripping the skin off their gods and stuffing it into wooden crates. And according to multiple Spanish accounts from the period, the priests warned them repeatedly that the gold would destroy anyone who carried it away from the temples. The Spanish, being 16th century Catholics who considered Aztec religion to be demon worship, did not take the warning seriously. Cortés and the conquest. The man at the center of all of this was Hernán Cortés, and whatever you think you know about Cortés, the reality is worse. He was a minor Spanish nobleman from Extremadura, a dry, poor region of western Spain that produced an extraordinary number of conquistadors, probably because there was nothing at home worth staying for. He arrived on the coast of Mexico in February 1519 with about 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. He was not authorized to conquer anything. His orders from the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, were to explore the coastline and trade with the natives. Cortés ignored those orders almost immediately. He founded the settlement of Villa Rica de la Veracruz. appointed himself its commander, and then did something so audacious it borders on insanity. He burned his own ships, or scuttled them, depending on the source. Either way, his men could no longer retreat. The message was clear: we go forward, or we die here. Then he marched inland toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. What he found there stunned him. Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities on Earth. It sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 massive causeways. The population was somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, which made it larger than any city in Spain at the time, larger than London, larger than Paris. The markets alone covered areas the size of entire European towns, and the temples were covered floor to ceiling in gold. Cortés wrote a letter to King Charles V of Spain describing what he saw, and even in translation, you can feel the greed dripping off the page. He described walls lined with gold leaf, ceremonial masks inlaid with turquoise and gold, golden figurines of jaguars and eagles and serpents, golden plates used in blood sacrifices, and a massive golden disc representing the sun god Tonatiuh that was reportedly the size of a wagon wheel. The Aztec emperor, Montezuma II, initially welcomed Cortés as a guest. There's a long historical debate about whether Montezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, or whether he was simply playing a diplomatic game. But either way, he gave Cortés gifts, enormous quantities of gold. And Cortés, rather than being satisfied, took Montezuma hostage and demanded more. La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. What happened next is one of the most controversial events in the history of the Americas. In June 1520, tensions between the Spanish and the Aztecs exploded into open warfare. The Spanish were trapped inside the city, surrounded by tens of thousands of furious Aztec warriors. Montezuma was killed, either by the Spanish or by his own people, depending on which account you believe, and Cortés ordered a nighttime retreat across the causeways. This is the event known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. And this is where the cursed legend really begins. Cortés had been accumulating gold for months. His men had been stripping temples, melting down artifacts, and packing the gold into every container they could find. When the retreat was ordered, the soldiers had a choice: drop the gold and run light, or carry the gold and risk drowning in the canals that cut across the causeways. A lot of them chose the gold. The causeways had gaps where bridges had been removed by the Aztecs. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold stuffed into their armor, their pockets, their saddlebags, fell into the water and sank straight to the bottom. Hundreds of them drowned, not from the fighting, but from the weight of stolen gold pulling them under. The lake literally swallowed them. And here's the detail that the Aztec chroniclers emphasized and the Spanish tried to play down. The priests had told them this would happen, not in vague mystical terms, but in very specific ones. The gold belongs to the gods. Take it from the temples and it will drag you to your death. And on La Noche Triste, that's exactly what it did, literally. Now, the gold that sank into Lake Texcoco during La Noche Triste has never been recovered. Mexico City was built directly on top of the old lake bed, and the treasure is believed to be somewhere beneath the streets of the modern city, buried under centuries of sediment and construction. Treasure hunters have been looking for it since the 1600s. Nobody has found it. But that's only part of the lost gold. The bigger mystery is what happened to Montezuma's personal treasury. According to multiple sources, both Spanish and indigenous, Montezuma maintained a treasury of almost incomprehensible size. Gold, silver, jade, turquoise, featherwork, and precious stones accumulated over generations of Aztec conquest. When it became clear that the Spanish intended to steal everything they could carry, there are accounts suggesting that Aztec loyalists moved the treasury out of Tenochtitlan before the city fell. Where they moved it to is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Americas. Some accounts place it in the mountains north of Mexico City. Others say it was taken south into Oaxaca. A few legends point to a flooded cave system in the state of Guerrero. The most persistent theory claims the treasure was carried to a location called Cerro del Muerto, a mountain in central Mexico, and sealed inside a cave that was then collapsed and hidden. None of these locations have produced the treasury, and the curse stories attached to every single one of them are remarkably consistent. People who go looking for Montezuma's gold get sick. They have accidents, their equipment fails, their guides abandon them, and in at least 3 documented cases from the 19th and 20th centuries, expedition leaders died under circumstances that their companions described as unexplainable. The pirates and the cargo. Now let's talk about how this gold got tangled up with pirates. Because the connection isn't metaphorical, it's direct, documented, and far more extensive than you'd expect. After Cortés finally conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521, the Spanish spent the next 2 centuries systematically extracting every precious metal they could find from Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and the rest of their American colonies. The gold and silver were loaded onto ships called galleons, organized into massive convoys called flotas, and sailed back to Spain along those Atlantic routes we talked about at the beginning. The scale of this operation is hard to comprehend. Between 1500 and 1650, the Spanish shipped approximately 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas to Europe. That's not a typo, 16,000 tons of silver. The influx was so massive that it caused inflation across the entire European continent. Prices in Spain doubled, then tripled. The Spanish economy, paradoxically, was destabilized by its own wealth. Economists call this the Spanish price revolution, and it's one of the most dramatic examples of resource curse in recorded history. But all of that treasure had to cross the Caribbean first. And the Caribbean, by the late 1500s, was crawling with pirates. The first wave of Caribbean pirates weren't even really pirates in the modern sense. They were French Huguenot privateers, Protestant sailors who attacked Spanish Catholic ships, partly for profit and partly out of religious hatred. The English followed, with men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins operating under letters of marque from Queen Elizabeth I. By the early 1600s, the Caribbean was essentially an undeclared war zone where Spanish treasure fleets were attacked by English, French, and Dutch raiders operating with varying degrees of government authorization. The most famous pirate hunting ground was the Straits of Florida, the narrow passage between Cuba and the Florida Keys where the Gulf Stream created a natural bottleneck. Spanish galleons had to pass through this corridor to catch the Atlantic currents back to Spain, and every pirate captain in the Caribbean knew it. They waited in coves along the northern coast of Cuba and in the shallow waters around the Florida Keys, watching the horizon for the distinctive silhouette of a loaded galleon riding low in the water. A ship sitting deep meant cargo. Cargo meant gold. They attacked when they found stragglers separated from the main convoy, picking off wounded ships the way wolves separate a limping deer from the herd. The amount of treasure captured by pirates during this period is staggering. Sir Francis Drake alone, during his 1572 to 1573 raids on the Isthmus of Panama, captured enough Spanish gold and silver to fund the English Navy for years. Henry Morgan's 1671 sack of Panama City yielded somewhere between 400,000 and 750,000 pieces of 8, depending on the source. And those are just the famous ones. Hundreds of smaller raids, captures, and hijackings occurred every year for over 2 centuries. And here's where the curse mythology gets interesting, because the pirates who seized Spanish gold weren't just stealing money. They were unknowingly taking possession of melted-down Aztec temple artifacts, gold that had been pried off the walls of Tenochtitlan, gold that had been shaped into ceremonial masks and sacrificial blades and sun discs before being melted into anonymous bars by Spanish smelters. The spiritual identity of the gold was destroyed by the melting process, but according to Aztec belief, the curse wasn't attached to the shape, it was attached to the substance itself. This idea that the gold carries a curse regardless of what form it takes is exactly the concept that Pirates of the Caribbean picked up and ran with. In the first film, The Curse of the Black Pearl, the cursed Aztec gold is a chest of 882 identical gold coins called Pieces of Cortés. The curse doesn't care who has the gold or what they do with it. It corrupts everyone who touches it. The pirates become undead, unable to feel pleasure, unable to taste food, unable to die. They exist in a state of living death, driven by the gold they can't stop wanting and can't get rid of. That's not just a clever movie plot, it's a surprisingly accurate adaptation of the actual Aztec curse mythology, filtered through 3 centuries of pirate folklore. The San Jose legend. But let's go deeper, because the real history has layers that the movie barely scratched. There's a specific legend, documented by multiple historians of the colonial period, about a Spanish galleon called the San Jose, not the famous one that sank off the coast of Colombia in 1708, although that ship is relevant too. This is a different San Jose, a smaller vessel that allegedly carried a collection of unmelted Aztec gold artifacts from Veracruz sometime in the 1560s. According to the legend, this cargo was not standard treasury gold. It included items taken directly from a sealed chamber beneath the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, items that the Spanish authorities had initially refused to touch because even the Catholic priests accompanying the expedition were disturbed by them. The artifacts allegedly included a golden skull mask with obsidian eyes, several golden serpent figurines with ruby inlays, and a large golden disc that some accounts describe as a calendar stone and others describe as a sacrificial altarpiece. The ship reportedly ran into a storm near the western tip of Cuba and was forced to anchor in a protected bay. During the night, according to the sailors' accounts that were later recorded by a Franciscan friar, the crew reported hearing sounds from the cargo hold, scratching, tapping, a low vibration that they could feel through the hull of the ship. By morning, 3 sailors were dead. There were no wounds on their bodies, no signs of illness, nothing to explain what killed them. They were just dead in their hammocks with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The captain ordered the gold thrown overboard. His officers refused. They put the artifacts in a longboat, rowed them to shore, and buried them on the beach. The ship continued to Spain without the cursed cargo. Now, is this story true? Almost certainly not in its specific details. The scratching sounds, the mysterious deaths, the frozen terror, these are embellishments layered on over centuries of retelling. But the core of the story, that certain Aztec gold artifacts were considered so dangerous that even the Spanish refused to transport them, does appear in multiple independent sources from the 1560s and 1570s. Something about those specific artifacts frightened people who were otherwise perfectly happy to loot everything in sight. The most rational explanation is that the artifacts were connected to Aztec death rituals, specifically to the worship of Mictlantecutli, the Aztec god of the underworld. Mictlantecutli was depicted as a skeleton wearing a necklace of human eyeballs, and his temple rites involved human sacrifice on a massive scale. Gold artifacts associated with his worship were not just religiously significant, they were, in the eyes of the Aztec priests, literally saturated with death energy. They had been present at thousands of human sacrifices. They had been bathed in blood. And according to Aztec cosmology, that spiritual residue didn't wash off. The Spanish priests, who despite their contempt for Aztec religion were deeply superstitious men living in an age of witchcraft trials and demonic possession, recognized something in these artifacts that their theology told them was real. They didn't believe in Aztec gods, but they absolutely believed in demons. And to a 16th century Catholic friar, an object used in blood sacrifice to a pagan deity wasn't just an idol, it was a vessel for demonic influence. It was spiritually contaminated. So, when the legends say the gold was cursed, they're drawing on 2 completely separate supernatural traditions that both independently concluded the same thing. The Aztecs said the gold was sacred to the death god and would punish anyone who stole it. The Spanish Catholics said the gold was contaminated by demonic ritual and would corrupt anyone who possessed it. 2 religions, 2 explanations, 1 conclusion. Don't touch the gold. The pirates who took the gold anyway. And the pirates? The pirates didn't care about either explanation. They took the gold anyway. And the legends that grew up around them suggest they came to regret it. There's a persistent story in Caribbean folklore about a pirate captain known as Redlegs Greaves, a Scottish-born privateer who operated in the Caribbean during the late 1600s. Greaves allegedly captured a Spanish ship carrying what the manifest described as temple gold of the Mexicans, items that had been overlooked during the initial looting period and were being shipped to Spain decades after the conquest. According to the story, Greaves distributed the gold among his crew, and within 3 months, every man who had taken a piece was either dead or insane. Greaves himself reportedly survived because he gave his share to a church in Barbados. The priest who accepted the donation was found dead the following week. Now, again, the specific details of this story are almost certainly fictional. Redlegs Greaves was a real historical figure, but his biography is so heavily mythologized that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. The point isn't whether Greaves actually encountered cursed Aztec gold. The point is that by the late 1600s, the idea of cursed Aztec gold in the Caribbean was so deeply embedded in pirate folklore that it was being attached to real historical figures and treated as established fact. This folklore tradition is what eventually made its way into literature. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, doesn't specifically reference Aztec curses, but the idea of cursed pirate treasure, gold that brings destruction to everyone who seeks it, runs through the entire novel. The black spot, the madness of Ben Gunn, the paranoia and betrayal among the treasure hunters, Stevenson was drawing on centuries of Caribbean folklore that said, essentially, stolen gold carries a price. By the time Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio sat down to write the screenplay for Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl in the early 2000s, they had centuries of source material to draw from, and they made a brilliant creative decision. Instead of inventing a generic movie curse, they grounded their mythology in the actual Aztec gold legend. The coins in the chest are explicitly linked to Cortez and the fall of the Aztec Empire. The curse is specifically tied to the desecration of sacred gold. And the manifestation of the curse, the transformation of the pirates into undead beings trapped between life and death, mirrors the Aztec concept of Mictlan, the underworld where the dead exist in a gray, joyless state of non-being. The screenwriters did their homework, and the result was a movie curse that felt genuinely mythic because it was built on a real mythological foundation. The curse as a security system. But there's one more layer to this story, and it's the one that treasure hunters find most compelling. Because the curse legends aren't just entertaining folklore, they may have been deliberately created to protect real treasure. Think about it from the perspective of the Aztec survivors of the conquest. Your civilization has been destroyed. Your temples have been torn down. Your gold has been stolen. But some of it, the most sacred artifacts, were hidden before the Spanish could find them. How do you protect those hiding places across generations? You can't post guards forever. You can't build fortifications that the Spanish won't eventually find. But you can create a story. A story so terrifying, so deeply embedded in the culture, that people will choose not to look for the gold even if they know roughly where it is. Curse legends as security systems. It sounds modern, almost cynical, but anthropologists have documented this pattern across dozens of cultures worldwide. The Egyptian pharaohs did it with tomb curses. Pacific Island cultures did it with taboo, sacred prohibitions enforced by spiritual punishment. West African societies did it with juju protections on sacred sites. The mechanism is always the same. Make the treasure more terrifying than it is valuable, and people will protect it for you out of pure fear. And there's evidence that it worked. In the mountains of Guerrero, Mexico, there is a cave system that local indigenous communities have guarded for centuries. Outsiders who try to enter are turned away, not with violence, but with warnings. The gold inside, they say, is not gold. It's the body of a god, and taking it will kill you. Archaeologists who have negotiated limited access to similar sites in the region have found exactly what you'd expect. Gold artifacts, ceremonial objects, items that match the descriptions of objects missing from the Templo Mayor inventories that the Spanish compiled after the conquest. The treasure is real, the caves are real, the indigenous guardians are real. Whether the curse is real is a question that depends entirely on what you mean by real. If you mean, does a supernatural force actively protect the gold? Then no, probably not. But if you mean, has the belief in the curse effectively prevented the gold from being stolen for 500 years? Then yes, absolutely. The curse has done exactly what it was supposed to do. It kept the gold where it belongs. The uncomfortable truth. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this entire story. The gold that the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise turned into a fun adventure movie was, in reality, the product of one of the most devastating acts of cultural destruction in human history. The Aztec Empire, for all its brutality, and it was brutal, with human sacrifice on a scale that genuinely horrified even the violent Europeans of the 16th century, was a sophisticated civilization with art, architecture, literature, mathematics, and astronomy. The Spanish didn't just take their gold. They destroyed their books, burned their libraries, demolished their temples, and killed or enslaved the vast majority of their population. Within a century of contact, the indigenous population of central Mexico dropped from an estimated 25 million people to roughly 1 million. Disease did most of the killing, but the Spanish conquest created the conditions for the disease to spread. The gold that ended up in pirate treasure chests was soaked in that history. Every single piece of it represented a temple that had been torn apart, a culture that had been erased, a people that had been destroyed. The curse, in a very real sense, wasn't supernatural at all. It was historical. The gold carried the weight of genocide, and everyone who touched it, from the Spanish conquistadors who melted it down, to the pirates who stole it from the Spanish, to the European economies that were destabilized by its arrival, suffered consequences. Cortés himself died wealthy, but bitter, constantly embroiled in legal disputes with the Spanish crown over his share of the conquest proceeds. His descendants fought over the gold for generations. Francisco Pizarro, who conquered Peru using the same playbook Cortés used in Mexico, was assassinated by his own men in a dispute over treasure. Henry Morgan, the greatest of the Caribbean pirates, drank himself to death at 53. His fortune evaporated, his body destroyed by the lifestyle his wealth had enabled. And Spain itself, the country that received the most stolen gold in history, it went bankrupt multiple times. Between 1557 and 1666, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy 6 times. The gold that was supposed to make Spain the richest nation on earth instead fueled inflation, corruption, military overextension, and eventual decline. By the 1700s, Spain was a second-rate power, and the gold was gone, spent on wars, palaces, and debts that the treasure could never satisfy. Every single entity that possessed the Aztec gold was ultimately destroyed by it, not by supernatural curse, but by the predictable consequences of building an economy on theft and exploitation. The curse was real, it just wasn't magic. That's what makes the Pirates of the Caribbean mythology so unexpectedly resonant. The movie presents the curse as a supernatural phenomenon, undead pirates in moonlight, which is entertaining and visually spectacular. But strip away the skeleton effects and the CGI, and you're left with a story about men who stole sacred gold from a destroyed civilization and were consumed by it. That's not fantasy. That's the actual history of the Caribbean, from 1500 to 1800. The 882 coins in the Black Pearl's chest represent something that really existed, not 882 specific coins, obviously, but a body of gold that moved from Aztec temples to Spanish galleons, to pirate ships, to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, leaving a trail of death and destruction at every stage of its journey. Gold that multiple cultures across multiple centuries independently concluded was too dangerous to possess. Today, the treasure is still out there. Montezuma's lost treasury has never been found. The gold from La Noche Triste is still beneath Mexico City. Spanish galleons loaded with melted Aztec artifacts are scattered across the floor of the Caribbean, from the Straits of Florida to the coast of Colombia. The San Jose, the famous one that sank in 1708, is believed to contain between $4 and $17 billion worth of gold, silver, and emeralds. Multiple countries are currently fighting over salvage rights. And in the mountains of Mexico, in sealed caves guarded by communities who have been protecting them for 500 years, the unmelted artifacts sit exactly where the Aztec priests put them, untouched, unrecovered, and according to the people who guard them, still very much cursed. The gold doesn't want to be found. It never did. 500 years of expeditions, 500 years of treasure maps and sonar scans and dynamite charges blown into mountainsides, and the most sacred pieces are still exactly where the priests put them, untouched, unbroken, waiting in the dark. And if the last 5 centuries are anything to go by, maybe, just maybe, the priests were right all along.